אז אם כן, אנו עומדים בלוח הזמנים ואנחנו נעבור להרצאת המפתח של המרצה האורח, פרופסור אקסל בר-סופן מאוניברסיטת מנהיים בגרמניה.
Good morning, Minister and ladies and gentlemen. Let me actually thank you for inviting me here to Jerusalem. It's not only a great honor to speak here, but it's just fun and pleasure. So I very much appreciate this. I want to actually start congratulating the Israeli team for getting the survey together. I definitely know that this is not easy, and it has been particularly hard during those times you were collecting the data. So big congratulations to Leah Achdut, to Howie Litwin, and I also think, where's Eli? He really shouldered lots of the work here. Thanks a lot. What I want to do is sort of give you a general overview what the SHARE project is all about. And sort of start with the purposes. I think Howie already mentioned, the main aim is really understanding the impact of aging. And that seems to be sort of a trivial, almost a banality, but it's not. There are lots of things we do not really understand about the aging process, neither for individuals nor for society as a whole. And for society as a whole, this is quite obvious because we never had an aging process. And although Israel is a fairly young country, it's aging quickly. Just because it's a young country, it's aging faster than other countries. So you will actually see a lot of changes during the next 10, 20, 30 years, quite a long horizon, and we try to contribute a little bit to that understanding. Now, one of the purposes is just to describe what is going on. And it's amazing how many simple statistics we do not have. Who is really in poverty, who feels bad, how is bad health correlated to bad economic situations? There are lots of just plain statistics which we have to generate. But even more interesting is to understand why certain things happen. Why the poor, for example, have worse health than the rich. What is the mechanism which actually will drive it? Because there are many possible explanations for that, and they require different policies. So these are the kind of aims we have, and we try to have them. Now, there are two principles in how to run SHARE and actually to get answers to these questions. One is to get the full pictures, not just look at one dimension. But it's very important to look at health at the same time as we look at economic conditions, and at the same time we look at the family and social environment and look at the interactions between those domains. And that is something which couldn't be really done well because we didn't have the data, and SHARE is contributing to that. The second principle is something which is also underdeveloped in research. If you try to learn something about how society has changed people, how policies, history, different cultures, then this is very hard to do in one single country. Because it's one linear stream, and usually policies don't change and cultures don't change so much. But if you compare different countries, then you see what difference it makes, and you see the different outcomes in different countries. That's why we're very eager to collect the very same data in many countries. If we see different policies in the past, we actually can relate the outcomes to those different policies. And we need differences. So that is also the importance why, as a continental European, I so much appreciate that Israel is part of it. Because Israel has a complete set of different histories, and we try to learn from the different experiences in Israel. And I also hope that Israel can profit from that, just by comparing, not only to the United States, but also to Europe, the different countries in Europe, what is actually happening. A good example is, and that was alluded to earlier, is the employment and actually the employability of older workers. That's a fairly complex question. That has obviously to do with pension incentives, how the pension system is run. That's something particularly economists like me are concentrating upon, but it also has to do with the workplace environment, how you actually do the workplaces. It has to do with preventive health care, which is something which is underutilized in most of the countries in Europe, maybe also in Israel, I don't know. But it also has something to do with family social factors, how well we can actually use the older workforce. I think you alluded to that yesterday night in the interview, that in Israel, I think it's about 1/3 of the people, 50 plus, are in the workforce, and it could be much more. Okay, so these are the principles, purposes of the survey. This is Share Country, and it shows the countries which belong to Share. From Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, including Israel. We did a first wave in continental Europe in 2004-2005, about 32,000 respondents, 50 plus. Then we had a second wave. This includes Israel. Now 15 countries with almost 40,000 respondents, so it's a large project. And I consider this, I'm actually brought up as a mathematician. I consider this as a laboratory. We have seen different policies, different histories. These are the experiments, quote unquote, which have happened in the past, and we try to learn from these experiments. But we can only learn from the experiments if we measure the same things, say health, on the same scale. Otherwise, we just confuse measurement errors and measurement differences. So an important point of Share is what we call ex-ante harmonized data. So we try to measure exactly the same thing in the different countries. And I come back to that. That's actually a challenge, and show you some details. Okay? So it's not only continental Europe. We have ELSA, which is a UK data set. We have the American data set, which sparked the entire enterprise. And recently we also have Korea, China, and Japan on board. So it's a truly international group of countries, and it's a lot of pleasure actually to talk to these different people all across the world. We collected, the kind of variables we measure are health, a lot of health variables. Let me not go into detail here. We collect a lot of economic variables to understand the economic status of the people. We collect the social network, how intertwined people are from family to friends. We collect psychological data, expectations, how you feel about your country, the pension system, the welfare system, and of course we ask the basic demographic data. So it's a large data set, lots of variables, and it appeals to a lot of different domains in science, from biology to medicine, to social sciences, to hardcore economics. As I said, the cross-national perspective gives a lot of opportunities, both for scientific but also for, say, applied policy evaluation purposes, because of the different backgrounds. And one aspect which I didn't mention is it's very helpful sort of to have benchmarks. And very often the United States is the benchmark, which I think does some kind of injustice to the cultural variation which you have in the Mediterranean plus Europe environment. So I think it's necessary to have multiple benchmarks to really see what's going on. And I think that's particularly important for Israel. It should not only compare to obviously to the United States, but also look at Scandinavia, which has a very interesting social policy model, and of course to the Mediterranean countries, your neighbors here. And then the aging process is sort of proceeds very, very, very differently. You all know that Italy has the most pronounced aging process in Europe. Then comes Germany. Then with sort of 20 years lag come countries like the UK and the United States. So you can actually learn from experience. And you see actually that in other countries things have happened which will happen in your own countries 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And this differential aging process is actually quite an opportunity to get insights before it happens. There are methodological challenges. If you look at different countries, you have to sample the same kind of individuals, households, which is difficult. You have to measure the same concept, and just looking at the different languages is very difficult. There are expressions in one country which just don't travel. Yesterday I learned that how to make ends meet has a very nice translation in Hebrew. There's no translation in German. So you have to use your fantasy to actually use the same question in different languages. For me, it's actually a lot of, well, just pleasure and fun to learn about those languages. My Hebrew is that small. So I'm lost there, but in other countries I can actually relate to this. And the very same question has a very different meaning in various countries, and I'll give you an example in a moment. What we did is in 2004 we had the first baseline wave. To have this wave, about 150 researchers were involved all across Europe. It's a very large project. On the European scale, it's about 21 million euro. What is that? $27 million. So it's a lot of, it's just multiplied by the many countries. You see that it's expensive. It's funded by the EU Commission, by the United States National Institute on Aging, and by national sources. And we were very grateful that the national sources actually paid for the operation in Israel. So without the government entities, the Israeli data collection would not have been possible. We spend a lot in electronics to run the survey. We released the data very quickly, and I think that is a hallmark of SHARE. A year after we started collecting the data, and before we finalized data collection in all over the country, we already released data to the researchers. And that is something very unusual. Usually people sit on the data, work on this data themselves for 2 years, and then they slowly give it to other researchers. We try not to do this monopoly policy, but give it to researchers right away and hope that they're enticed by the data and that actually will help us to keep the operation running. Then we sort of work on the data, we clean out the errors. Almost 2 years later we had a second release. And most of the analysis you will see in the rest of the day are based on that later release. We have about 700 users of the data, registered users, and behind are about 2,000 individuals. Again, that is really, I would say, if I may applaud ourselves, that is really a success story to get so many researchers working on the data. And that tells you that a lot of money is actually, it's worth the money we are spending. If you divide the number of individuals working on the data, then you see it's much cheaper than, say, physical or chemical research, which we're doing. Okay? Now, SHARE is not a one-time exercise. It cannot be, because aging is nothing which happens in a single spot of time, but it's a process over time. So if you want to understand how people age, you actually have to look at people, how they age. And that happens in time. So you have to look at the very same people at one point when they're relatively young, and then you see them 2 years later, 4 years later, 6 years later. Otherwise, you will never understand how people age. You will also not understand how people age to the changes in policy, because there are policy changes and then people react on it. And only if you see the reaction of these people, you will really understand public policy. So it's very important to keep what we call panel for a certain time. So in continental Europe, we already had our second wave. Actually, we are now in the process of putting the third wave in the field. For the second wave, which just ended a couple of months ago, we have about 35,000 individuals. We added countries, the Czech Republic, Ireland, and Poland. Israel was sort of in between the two waves. And we tried to learn through this longitudinal perspective. The data release is planned for next July. Now, the third wave will be super interesting. What we do is we ask people about their lives. We go backwards in time. So we want to know how the people we now observe have done in their youth, because we believe that a lot of the, say, education, a lot of policies like education work early on, they work through the lifetimes, and we see the results particularly pronounced when the people are 50 plus. So it's the accumulation of policies which happened over life which we see in age 50 plus. So that's why we call it Share Life, the wave 3, and we very much hope that something of this sort will also happen in Israel. I think in Israel, looking at a life perspective is particularly important because the lives have been so unusual in Israel. There's a migration background, not to speak about what happened 50, 60 years ago, which has changed the country very differently from Europe. So looking at a lifetime perspective will be super interesting. There have been studies, but combining the share situation right now with a lifetime perspective 50 years ago will be particularly interesting for Israel. We hope that this will have a longer time perspective. We'll come, how we'll actually do this later when we have the roundtable. So let me not get into detail here, but rather talk a little bit about some of the results. I was talking about that if you ask the same question, you get different answers. It seems to be a very simple question: how are you doing health-wise? Okay, so the question is, over the last 12 months, would you say that your health has, on the whole, been very good, good, fair, bad, very bad? This is a question of the Eurobarometer, and you should think that people have an easy answer to those questions. You're actually struck by the differences. This is the most frequent answer. Now, in some countries, blessed Denmark and Sweden, the most frequent question is very good. Imagine a country where most people say, or the most frequent answer is, my health is very good. You have other countries, not the least Germany, but also some of the Mediterranean countries like Italy and and Portugal, where the most frequent answer is fair, which is a fairly lousy answer to your health. If you turn this around, actually, where's Israel? Well, Israel, to my surprise, also the most frequent answer is fair, which is sort of a mediocre outcome. Now, if you look at the percentage who say very good, then it's also strikingly. In some countries, like Denmark, you have 42% of the people saying my health is very good. In Portugal, it's just 3%. In Israel, it's actually in the middle of it. It's 21%, twice as good as in Germany. Congratulations. Do you believe that data? Well, I think you should be careful interpreting that data. It has a lot to do with culture. It has a lot to do how you answer these kind of questions. You cannot take these questions at face value. Germans are well known to be whiners. If you ask them how they're feeling, they say, well, I'm plodding along. The Scandinavians are well known to be very optimistic, and even if it's rainy, they say it's very good. So, what do we learn? We have to be very careful in how we measure things across countries. We have to do a lot of work to actually get harmonized data. So we very carefully phrase our questions. We phrase them on the computer, so the interviewers cannot deviate from the question. But point 3 is particularly important. We try to measure as objectively as we can. And in terms of health, we do a lot of effort. We not only ask people how they feel, we not only ask what the doctor has said, we actually measure the a lot of physical things, so to try to make it comparable across country. We do a lot of effort in terms of language. We very carefully translate. We still find translation errors. Actually, I appreciate all the work the translators are doing right now for my English here. And we train our interviewers a lot. We have a very complicated electronic field management system where we try to keep all these different interviewers. We have almost 1,000 interviewers under control. And finally, we do some data conversion when we see there were systematic errors. Now, the outcome is actually amazing. Now, this is measurement of health as I showed it to you before, subjectively. And these are a few countries. You see Denmark on the top. You see Spain at the ES at the bottom. Now, if you correlate this with healthcare expenditures, then you see virtually no correlation. So the policy conclusion would be there's no point in spending extra money in healthcare because health doesn't get better. That is the wrong conclusion. If you use the more careful share measurement, where you put all the effort in measuring share on health on many dimensions, you see there's much more correlation between healthcare expenditures and healthcare outcomes, with Switzerland on top and Spain at the bottom. And you see there is, once you measure the things right, you actually get away from this superficial kind of answer. It's actually funny to look at Germany and Denmark. DK is Denmark, DE is Germany. If you measure it sort of the naive way it's done in social surveys, you get that the Danes have a much better health than the Germans. If you measure it the share way, actually it goes away. You get another outcome, which is that the Germans spent much more on healthcare than the Danes, and the Dutch and the Austrians, for the same kind of outcomes, so they have a more inefficient healthcare system, which is something which is interesting for healthcare policy. This brings me to the general problem of topic of health disparities. In general, health is pretty good in Europe. It's much better than in the United States, and that's something to be proud of. The 60% of men 50 plus report very good or good health. It's a little worse for women. You have the same pattern in Israel on a somewhat less elevated scale. What is very interesting is the difference between North and South in Europe. Health measured objectively by walking speed or grip strength is much better in the North than in the Mediterranean. And these are very significant differences. In Scandinavia, people walk faster. This is not because it's so cold you better walk, but this is measured. It's about the size from here to you. In the houses, and it's much slower in the Mediterranean. Also, if people have to use the grip strength, it's lower in the Mediterranean than in Scandinavia, very systematically so. Now, Israel is actually more in the continental. This is the bluish bar that symbolizes Israel. And it's for men and women together. Israel is closer to the continental European scale than to the Mediterranean scale. And that's actually an amazing finding. It's on walking speed, and you find a similar thing in grip strength. So health objectively measured in Israel is better than the subjective measurement in which you have seen before. So the difference between what you say and what actually happens is pronounced in Israel, which is an interesting finding. Of course, it's very interesting to try to understand how these north-south differences emerged. Is it income? Is it education? Is it the healthcare system? That is something which is still an open research question. If you look at the differences of health in terms of education level, the numbers here mean 2 means that for lower educated people, health ratings are twice as bad as for better educated people, or the other way around, depending how you want to interpret it, and the same for income. And you see that if you just take self-perceived health, those people who are better educated have twice as often better health than those who are ill-educated. And with income, which is the fourth bar, it's a little less, it's about 1.6. So there's a strong correlation between income and education and health. If you look, you have the same phenomenon in Israel. If I read the numbers right, then this education gradient is not as pronounced in Israel as it is in continental Europe. That I actually find a surprising finding. I wish I would understand more about Israel to understand this. But I think we will have later in the day more on that issue. If we look at actually which drives these differences, then diabetes and lung diseases are the main drivers for the socioeconomic differences. That is an interesting finding because it points to behavior. It's obviously smoking and diet which drives part of these differences. Another interesting topic is employment. I think Lea Achdut will speak more on that. This is something which you can only do in share. This is looking at the economic activity of healthy and what I call functioning respondents only. So I look at the number of workers, these are the yellow bars, and retirees, these are the gray bars, country by country, but only for people who say they feel healthy. Okay? Still, you see a huge difference. In Sweden, there are more people working than not working. In Italy, it's exactly the other way around by a wide margin. So, health doesn't explain this, because we condition on health. It's the healthy people only. So in spite of good health, there are way more people retired in Italy than there in Sweden. Something else is going on. Guess what it is? I'll show you in the next graph. This is about, actually, my question is, where is Israel here? And you probably will make some remarks. I'll show you some, and this will give you the answer in a moment, and then I will finish. This is the map of Europe in terms of disability insurance, or early retirement financed by disability insurance. And you see there's a huge difference. You have some countries where this is 30 to 16%, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. Other countries where it's very low, Austria, for example, but also Greece. In the United States and Central Europe is sort of in between. Israel is actually on the little higher side, but it's not as extreme as the red countries. The percentage is about 8%. Now, if you actually look what is explained of the differences, these are again the disability insurance rates. So you see in Sweden, it's about 15%. And in Denmark, it's also very high. If you try to explain this by demographic, by the age of the people, and by the health of the people, nothing of these differences go away. So this early retirement has nothing to do with health status. If you look at the generosity, at the ease of these disability and early retirement programs, particularly at the ease how you get into those programs, then it makes a big difference. Essentially, you flatten out the country differences, which means that most of the international variation from country to country is explained by the generosity of these programs. They have huge, as we say in economic terms, incentive effects, and they are more a driver of disability insurance than health, which is a striking finding. Okay. You see, I could go on forever because I really think these are very interesting topics. SHARE provides a lot of research opportunities, and that's what SHARE is all for. It provides these research opportunities essentially for 4 reasons. One is it's cross-national, so you can compare. Second, because it's multidisciplinary. And that is an eye-opener, because you see different sort of connections which you haven't seen before. I think particularly the connections between health and socioeconomics is fascinating and underexplored. The third one is it will be, and in times in continental Europe it already is, longitudinal. So you actually see the aging process and you see the reaction to reforms. And the fourth point, and I really stress this, SHARE is driven by researchers. So it's the questions come out of, which we pose to the people, come out of research questions. So the time between designing the data, designing the survey, and actually getting answers from the survey are short. And we're up to date in terms of research questions. And both these four, all the four of these elements are quite important and make SHARE different from other operations. Let me finish by saying that I'm happy, I'm really glad that Israel is part of the SHARE family. I hope it will stay in the family for many more years. Thank you.
I will say just a word in English so that Professor Bir-Supan can understand directly. I want to thank you for your illuminating remarks, your insight, and your detail and your explanation. I think this was a very, very important overview, and I think we've learned a lot. So thank you very much.